We come now to our last lecture in the Gospel of Luke. In the previous lecture, we broke off in the middle, actually, of the story of the trial of Jesus. We saw that he was taken by armed guard after his arrest in Gethsemane. He was taken to the private residence of Caiaphas, the high priest. And in the process of these early wee hours of the morning, Jesus is going to be condemned to death for blasphemy. But as I mentioned earlier, they are going to need to take him to the Roman governor to secure an execution. So this hearing, this early hearing by the Sanhedrin, is certainly not the end of the story, and we're going to continue that story here in the latter part of our lectures on Luke. We're going to pick up with the story of Peter, who has gained access to the private residence of the high priest and is warming himself at one of the fires. Now, Jesus has already said that Peter would deny the Lord. And in fact, Jesus had told Peter, I'm praying for you that your faith will not fail in this trial. Peter, of course, did not believe that he would deny the Lord. And in fact, he's quite emphatic that he would even be willing to die for Jesus. But now that he is in the courtyard of the high priest's home, and there are people that begin to ask him directly whether or not he was with Jesus, or he was a disciple of Jesus, or he knew Jesus, Peter is afraid, and he is going to deny the Lord just as Jesus had said he would. Now, Luke is going to add one very important detail to this description. The denials of Peter are recorded in all four of the Gospels, but this one detail that Luke adds is unique to Luke's Gospel, because at the very time Peter was making this final denial that he knew Jesus, at that very moment, Jesus was being moved out of the high priest's private residence and probably on his way would be on his way to be taken to Pilate. And Jesus now hears Peter's final denial, and he looks straight at Peter. What a world of communication must have been in that silent glance. And when Peter saw Jesus looking at him, he went outside and began to cry. The rooster crowed, just as Jesus said it would, that barnyard signal that what Jesus had predicted had come to pass. Jesus now is going to go before Pilate, who is the Roman governor, and he has the final decision in matters of execution. We know this not from Luke's gospel, but from John's gospel, but it certainly fits into the larger scheme of things. And that idea that the Roman prefect had the final decision in executions seems to be borne out by some things in the writings of Flavius Josephus. Pilate is aroused early for this, and he's probably not in a very good mood. He seems to suspect that this issue is more religious than it is political, and he is in fact reluctant to give an execution order. After examining Jesus, he doesn't seem to see Jesus as a threat to Rome. I think Pilate pretty much sees through the mask of the Jewish leaders. In fact, he even attempts to refer this case to Herod once he hears that Jesus is from Galilee. So he sends him to Herod. But this doesn't, in fact, end up with Jesus' trial ending in the court of Herod. Herod wants to see Jesus. In fact, earlier he had wanted to see Jesus. Now he does get to see Jesus, but Jesus says absolutely nothing to Herod. And in the end, Herod's just going to send him back to Pilate. When he comes back to Pilate, the Sanhedrin, which is the ruling body of the Jews, is still going to press for an execution. And they're going to call for the release of a prisoner, Barabbas. Now, there's an irony here in that the name Barabbas, which is an Aramaic name, means the son of the father. The term bar, which is the Aramaic prefix that means the son of, and Abba, which is the Aramaic word for father, means that his name means the son of the father. And so what you have here is this irony that there are two figures, both who are slated for execution, one of them Barabbas, the son of the Father, the other Jesus, the son of the Father. But in this case, of course, the guilty one will be allowed to go free, and the innocent one will be killed. Eventually, Pilate consented to Jesus' execution. Now, there's quite a bit of background to Pilate's relationship with the Jews, and there are some good reasons why he would sort of knuckle under, I suppose you might say, to the Jewish leaders. He had had some problems before. He had been reported to the Caesar in Rome, so he had gotten himself into some difficulties. So he is treading gingerly, and even though he probably thinks Jesus is not deserving of death, he is willing to go that route simply in order to keep peace between himself and the Sanhedrin. So he delivers Jesus over for scourging and sentences him to be crucified. Now, crucifixion and burial in the four Gospels follows a very common pattern. Almost all of the elements of this part of the death of Jesus are in all four of the Gospels. There are a few points that in this or that Gospel is unique. For instance, John's Gospel has two or three kinds of things that you don't find elsewhere. The committing of Mary, Jesus' mother, into the care of John, for instance, the piercing of Jesus. Luke is basically going to follow the same pattern that you find in Matthew and Mark, although in a case or two there are some added details there as well. In particular, in Luke's gospel, this is where you have one of the two thieves that are crucified with Jesus who apparently comes to faith in this sort of last moment before his death. And he asks Jesus to remember him. And Jesus promises that you today will be with me in paradise. We'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Jesus, of course, is buried. The women are going to come on Easter morning to bring spices to the tomb. So Luke's account is very much similar to the accounts that you find in Matthew and Mark. We do need to say a little bit about Roman crucifixions, however. Roman crucifixions were not for Roman citizens. In fact, many years later, St. Paul is going to be executed, but because he was a Roman citizen, he is exempt from crucifixion, and he will simply be beheaded. But crucifixions were reserved for non-citizens, for the lowest people with the lowest status in society, and they were a particularly brutal and excruciating kind of death. The Romans didn't invent crucifixions. They probably adopted them from Carthage. But by the time of Jesus, there had been literally thousands of crucifixions in the Roman Empire. Generally speaking, Roman crucifixions had three parts of the process. First, there was scourging. Now, there's no limit to Roman flogging. The Jews had a limit based upon a passage in Deuteronomy where scourging was limited to simply 40 stripes. Other ancient Near Eastern laws sometimes had limits. The Code of Hammurabi, for instance, limited flogging to 60 stripes. But there was no limit to Roman flogging. And so we don't know how many times Jesus felt the lash, but it was particularly brutal. The Roman flogging was done by a lictor, sort of a professional, if you will, in this grisly art. He had a short-handled whip into which were woven strips of leather, and within the strips of leather there were little pieces of jagged metal woven into it, pieces of glass, things that would rip and tear the flesh as the person was being scourged. We actually have records of people dying under crucifixion, and sometimes people were disemboweled by scourging. This is a very horrible thing. The art of this, I suppose, was to beat the prisoner until he was almost dead, but not quite dead, and then he would be taken to crucifixion. Crucifixion itself involved the carrying of the crosspiece, called a patibulum, to the site of the execution. In most of the art pieces that we have from, the Renaissance period, for instance, they show Jesus carrying the full cross. That is probably not correct. Probably the upright part of the cross was left in a semi-permanent location, and the prisoner simply carried the cross piece. The cross piece then, after the prisoner had been nailed, his hands or forearms nailed to the cross, then the cross piece would be lifted up onto the upright. Also, the carrying of the patibulum was usually accompanied by an inscription that was hung around the neck of the prisoner, an inscription that would say what his crime had been. We don't know whether Jesus had this. It's called a titulus. But we do know that when Jesus was crucified, a title was placed on the top of the cross. Now, this may actually have been a title that Jesus wore around his neck as he carrying the crosspiece to the site of execution. The execution itself, the crucifixion itself, was basically nailing the prisoner to the crosspiece, sometimes tying him to the crosspiece, but probably as often as not nailing him there. Crosses were not always uniform. They could be T-shaped. They could be dagger-shaped. In fact, we find references they could be X-shaped. We typically think of the cross of Jesus as probably either T-shaped or dagger-shaped, but there were a couple of other parts to the cross that may be worth mentioning. Sometimes there was a sharp projection about halfway down the upright, sort of like a peg that fit beneath the pelvis of the crucified victim. So it partly suspended his weight, but would be particularly painful. There is one of the Roman writers who uses this phrase that he doesn't want to sit on the cross. Now, as a Roman citizen, he wouldn't have to anyway, but he's using this as an illustration. But the idea of sitting on the cross is probably a reference to this projection called a sedile. Sometimes there was also a foot support, which would also help suspend the weight. This is called a suppedaneum. So these are the three parts of Roman crucifixion. And Jesus, of course, is going to be a victim in all three of these instances. Should you be interested in reading a medical account of the crucifixion of Jesus, I would highly recommend an article that was written in the Journal of the American Medical Association back in the 1980s. This is a medical treatment of what crucifixion involved and how it proceeded and what would happen to the victim physiologically. Death was by shock or gradual asphyxiation as the prisoner continued to push himself up from the nails in his feet so that he could breathe. When he couldn't stand that any longer, he would sag, and then that would tend to depress his lungs. And eventually the back and forth movement of the prisoner until he lost muscle tone would continue. Eventually he would be unable to raise himself in order to breathe, and eventually he would asphyxiate. This is why in the Gospel of John, for instance, you find them breaking the shins of the prisoners, because when the shins are broken, then of course the prisoner is unable to lift himself up and he will die more quickly. In any case, you can find this article easily online if you want to. I've given you the publication details here, and it is a very insightful treatment and a very respectful treatment of the death of Jesus by crucifixion. Of all of the thousands of people that the Romans crucified, we only have for certain the remains of one. And that's because, normally speaking, nailing a prisoner to a cross through either the upper part of like the heel of the hand, the upper part of the wrist or the heel of the hand, and through the feet does not necessarily leave any evidence in skeletal remains. You might have a spike that leaves a groove in a bone, for instance, but we only have one that is absolutely certain, and it's this one that I'm showing you here. This was excavated in 1986 in Jerusalem, and this is from the foot bone, in particular the heel bone of a Jewish man who was crucified probably in his mid to late 20s. Now, the interesting thing about this artifact is that you can see very clearly that the spike has gone through the heel bone from the side, but then the tip of the spike has curled. Anybody who's ever done carpentry work knows that sometimes when you're driving a nail with a hammer, if you hit a very hard piece in the interior of the wood, that sometimes the nail will curl. And this seems to be what has happened to this spike. Unable to remove this spike then because of that curling tip, they simply amputated his leg and they buried him with the spike still through his heel bone. The fact that the spike is through the side of the heel bone has been quite intriguing for scholars and archaeologists, especially because it means that our normal way of thinking about Jesus on the cross might need to be adjusted. Normally in paintings that we have, Renaissance paintings and so on, we generally see Jesus crucified so that the feet are placed one on top of the other, kind of like that, and then the spike driven down through both feet, or else two spikes, one for each foot, but through the top of the foot. This, on the other hand, seems to suggest otherwise. And so scholars have envisioned three other possibilities for crucifixions with the feet in this position. And so you can see those three here. In the end, we don't know whether any of these were the methods that were used for Jesus. The crucifixion of Jesus might in fact have been, as we typically think about it and as we see in paintings in the museums of the world. But on the other hand, it may have been somewhat different, as is illustrated by these drawings. I did notice in a cathedral in Europe a couple of years ago, they had a painting of the crucifixion, and they actually painted the crucifixion similar to one of these three positions on the cross. And I have to believe that they did that precisely because of this excavated heel bone back in the 1980s. I actually asked the priest at the cathedral if that had been the case, and he wasn't sure. But he found it very interesting that there was some actual archaeological evidence behind the painting that was in his church. From the cross, Jesus is going to give 7 sayings. Christians are pretty used to hearing these sayings in things like Good Friday services. Both Matthew and Mark are going to have the cry of dereliction, my God, why have you forsaken me?" which is in fact a part of Psalm 22, the introduction to Psalm 22. Jesus seems to have prayed the Psalms, which I think is also an emphasis of Luke. Luke is going to have Jesus praying something from the Psalms, but not this particular one. He's going to mention another one. John, of course, has some sayings that are not found anywhere else in the other 3 Gospels. So Luke is going to have Jesus saying, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing." So there is this prayer for forgiveness as one of the 7 sayings from the cross. But the other one, which is this saying, "Amen, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise," this one, and then the "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," these are the sayings that you find that are unique to Luke's gospel. It is interesting that the phrase "amen" that Jesus uses is sometimes used at the beginning of a sentence. That is unique, actually, and a characteristic of the words of Jesus that demonstrate he's not following a tradition when he does that. In Judaism, amen is always said at the end of the statement, but Jesus often says it at the beginning, and sometimes he has a double amen at the beginning. "Amen, amen, I say to you." The older English versions translated this by the word verily. Modern translations often find some other way to express that. This final saying that Luke records, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," again is a prayer from the Psalms. It's from Psalm 31. So these are the 7 sayings of Jesus from the cross. 3 of them being in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus' death is going to occur about 3 p.m. in the afternoon, or as it says in the Gospels, the 9th hour. Now, the 9th hour probably is a Roman reckoning, which is somewhat different than Jewish reckoning. But the Romans reckoned the daylight hours from sunrise, which is about 6 o'clock, more or less. And so if Jesus is crucified and dies about the 9th hour, then he's going to die about 3 in the afternoon. At the time of Jesus' death, there was a great darkness that came over the face of the whole land. And interestingly enough, this darkness was noted by an ancient historian by the name of Thallus. He writes in about the middle of the 1st century, not very many years after the crucifixion of Jesus, and he describes it as an eclipse. In any case, Thallus is the first non-Christian to actually refer to Jesus in writing. And he does, in fact, connect this great darkness with the death of Jesus, attributing it to an eclipse. At the time that Jesus died, there was also an event that is described in other Gospels as well, the tearing of the inner curtain of the temple. This inner curtain was the curtain that separated the most holy place from the holy place in the temple. Sometimes this is called the veil, if you will. And inside the most holy place is where the high priest would enter once each year on Yom Kippur, the day of national atonement, and offer the blood of bulls and goats, first for himself and then for the whole nation. So this was a day of atonement for the whole nation. In describing the tearing of this inner curtain, that it was ripped in two, this has huge symbolic and theological significance because it means that this inner place, this place in which the presence of God once hovered over the Ark of the Covenant, that entryway or right to come into God's immediate presence has now been opened for all. It is no longer simply available to the high priest. It is available to everyone. And everyone is now able to come into the most holy place. Of course, at the time that Jesus dies, there's no Ark of the Covenant in the most holy place. After the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians back in the 6th century BC, there are no more references to the Ark of the Covenant. It disappears and has not been found since. There are some traditions in different places about what might have happened to it. I won't go into those at this point. But nonetheless, the tearing of that curtain in the temple is a way of saying that the immediate presence of God is now accessible to those who wish to come close. And then, of course, as Jesus finally dies, there is the exclamation of the Roman centurion. And he, again, pronounces that Jesus is innocent. So not only does Pilate, the governor, pronounce Jesus innocent, the Roman soldier who is in charge of the execution pronounces Jesus to be innocent. Both of these fit very well into the apologetic motif of Luke's gospel, that Jesus is not a threat to the Roman Empire. We've had quite a bit of difficulty trying to pinpoint exactly where Jesus died. You need to remember that Jerusalem has gone through quite a varied political history over the centuries, and it has been destroyed and rebuilt more than once. You probably are aware that in AD 70, the Romans are going to destroy Jerusalem. They're going to destroy the temple, just as Jesus predicted, in fact. And then, of course, Jerusalem is rebuilt. And then there is another Jewish revolt in the 130s AD. And once again, Jerusalem is going to be destroyed by the Romans, and this time again rebuilt. This time as a Roman city, so rebuilt by Trajan in the 2nd century. So with all of this destruction and rebuilding, what we have is I suppose, what you'd call an archaeological nightmare. It's very difficult to track all the way back to the 1st century pieces of Jerusalem that might be possible sites of the crucifixion. In any case, two very popular sites have been defended. Now, there are several more possibilities besides these two, but these two are the ones that are most widely accepted. One of them is called Gordon's Calvary, and the other is called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. As far as the New Testament itself is concerned, the only really clear identity marker is that the crucifixion of Jesus occurred outside the city wall. However, there's more than one city wall, and identifying which wall is the first century wall that we need to keep in mind for the crucifixion of Jesus has also been very elusive. In any case, these are the two places. The one was identified back in quite a long time ago by General Charles Gordon, who was a British military officer, because he thought that this configuration in the cliff looked like a skull. Now, Luke, of course, is going to tell us that Jesus was crucified at a place called the Skull. Geologists, on the other hand, are less than certain that this rock formation actually existed as far back as the first century. Some of them have suggested and attempted to demonstrate, actually, that this probably did not look like this in the first century. But in any case, because of its very visual impact, this has become a popular site for the crucifixion of Jesus. The older tradition, however, and this goes back all the way to the 300s, is that Jesus was crucified where eventually would be built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This site is attested in antiquity by the church historian Eusebius, who writes in the 4th and 5th century, by St. Jerome, also from about the same period of time. And of course, to people who go visit Jerusalem today, they will probably visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Because it is a church and is filled with all sorts of religious relics and paraphernalia, I suppose for some people that makes it a bit less than satisfying as they try to relate it to the crucifixion of Jesus. But it is, in fact, the site with the oldest tradition. Now, there is a factor in the burial of Jesus that is often not understood. As we understand from the Gospels, Jesus was taken down from the cross, and he is going to be buried in a tomb. Now, normally, Jewish burial is in a tomb, but normally it is in a family tomb. In the case of Jesus, this is going to be in a new tomb. Now, that is a bit awkward because normally you want a loved one to be buried, as the old idiom is, to be gathered to his fathers or to be gathered to the people in his ancestry who've been buried in the same tomb. This doesn't happen in the case of Jesus. So Jesus has what would probably be perceived as a somewhat dishonorable burial. The very fact that it was new was in itself a problem. So that means there was no tradition connected with the burial of Jesus as normally you would expect. There's no procession to the tomb with friends and family. Of course, Jesus is executed as a criminal, so it's right at the end of the day, beginning Sabbath at sundown, so that it's really awkward in many ways. But there's no public expressions of comfort to the family. Normally, members of the family would sit Shiva around the tomb for intense grieving for several days, and so there's none of that. Jesus is simply placed in this tomb. They aren't even able to do all of the preparation of spices that normally would be done. They sort of do this as quickly as they can because the Sabbath is dying, and they roll the stone over the entrance. Now, typically, tombs in the first century are going to be blocked by a blocking stone rather than a rolling stone. A blocking stone is more squarish in its shape, but it is clear from the gospel records that in the case of Jesus, the tomb actually had a rolling stone, and that will eventually be rolled back after the resurrection. Jesus is buried somewhere near where he was crucified, and the two most popular sites for this again, are going to be defended by different groups. One is called the Garden Tomb. If you get to go to Jerusalem and visit the city, you will likely want to visit the Garden Tomb. It's a wonderful place. It's very respectful. It is very well kept. There are places to sit and to meditate. And this tomb was located quite a long time ago by Protestant missionaries, and they believed it to be the tomb of Jesus. And it is still maintained by a society. However, there is an archaeological problem with this site, and that is that archaeologists think this tomb is much too old to be the tomb of Jesus. It certainly isn't a new tomb. Archaeologists say that this tomb probably dates to several centuries before the time of Jesus. So even though there are doubts about the authenticity of this place of burial, still, it is a very wonderful place to visit. It's a very wonderful place to just sit and to think about the death and burial of Jesus. Again, the place that has the best attestation from the ancient world is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And of course, it is named after the burial of Jesus. This has been revered as the burial place of Jesus since at least the 300s. So it has the earliest attestation that we have for the burial place of Jesus. So the crucifixion and the burial of Jesus, at least if we take the oldest tradition, is in this area of Jerusalem. We come now to the story of the resurrection, which is the climax of Luke's gospel. As we look at the resurrection in the four gospels, we're going to see that, again, they have many of the same elements, but there are some unique features in some of them, perhaps a bit more here than you have in the story of the crucifixion. John's gospel, in fact, has some of the most unique descriptions of Jesus after the resurrection. He appears to Mary Magdalene. He appears to the disciples without Thomas. Then he appears to the disciples with Thomas. And then he appears to 7 in Galilee. Matthew and Mark, of course, talk about the appearance of Jesus to the women on Easter morning. Only Matthew is going to talk about the report of the guard. But then Matthew is going to show Jesus appearing to 11 in Galilee, where he gives to them the Great Commission. Luke, for his part, is going to show Jesus appearing to the women on Easter morning, but he also has a fascinating story about Jesus appearing to a disciple by the name of Cleopas and his companion. We don't know anything about his companion. It could have been a friend. It could have been his wife. It just doesn't say. So we don't know who this companion was, but Jesus is going to go to them, go to their home and have supper with them. He also appears on Easter evening to the 11 that we find in Luke's gospel. And then eventually at the very end of his gospel, Luke is going to show Jesus taking his disciples to Bethany, which is probably a bit less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. And he's going to ascend into heaven from that area. So this is the story of the resurrection as you find it in Luke's gospel. It's absolutely fascinating that the first witnesses of the resurrection are women. Women did not have a very high status in Jewish society, and we talked about that in one of the earlier lectures. So the idea that the first witnesses to the resurrection were women is really part of not only Luke, but the early church's reassessment of the role of women within the believing community. The women, of course, have observed where Jesus was buried late on Friday evening. They had to wait until the Sabbath was passed, and they're going to return to the tomb early Sunday morning. Now, this means that if we say Jesus died on Friday and rose on Sunday morning, this fits very well with the statement that Jesus repeatedly made that he would die and rise on the third day. So if he dies on Friday, he rises on Sunday, that is definitely on the third day. There is, of course, the intriguing passage in Matthew's gospel that said Jesus would be 3 days and nights in the heart of the earth. That does not fit very well with the statement he rose on the third day. But the statement in Matthew may actually be an idiomatic statement, which really just includes any part of 3 days. So I think the idea that Jesus was crucified on Friday is highly likely, and that fits best with the statement that he rises on the third day. Well, the women, as they have come to the tomb early on Sunday morning, are confronted by two figures who announce to them that Jesus has risen. They find that the tomb is empty, and they are reminded by these two figures that Jesus had predicted this very thing. Now, these two figures we discover in other Gospels are probably angels. Whether the women immediately recognize them as angels or not, we don't know. But they are going to report that they had found the empty tomb. And so they came to the 11 and reported to them that they had seen the empty tomb. I'll come back to this statement that about the 11 in a moment, but for the time being, it simply means that Judas already has committed suicide. So their stories seem to be incredible. What do you mean the tomb is empty? What does that mean? Peter at least goes to investigate. And in fact, in the Gospel of John, we find that Peter is going to go with the beloved disciple to investigate. The two of them go together. Luke's Gospel only mentions Peter, but Peter goes to investigate, and in fact, he discovers that just as the women said, the tomb was empty. So what you have in Luke and in the Gospels in general are two kinds of testimony that lead us to Easter faith for Christians. One has to do with indirect evidence. This is the empty tomb that was discovered by the women and discovered by Peter on Easter morning. There doesn't seem to be any credible reason why anyone would want to move a corpse. Certainly the Jews wouldn't want to do it. They would want to protect the corpse to make sure that Jesus was truly dead and that they could prove it. They seem to be aware in some of the gospel records that Jesus had predicted he might rise again, and so they want to prevent that. In fact, in Matthew's gospel, there is a guard placed at the tomb to make sure that nobody tampers with it. And in fact, it is sealed with an official seal. So the idea that the tomb is empty is really an important indirect evidence. The women give their testimony. There is the announcement by the two figures at the tomb that the tomb is empty. There is the guard's report, which is in Matthew's gospel, of course, that the tomb has been opened. And there is the investigation by Peter that the tomb is empty as well. I would suggest that when they discovered that the stone was rolled away, that this indicates not that it was rolled away so that Jesus could get out, but so that the disciples could see in. The women wondered about this rolling stone, as you find in some of the stories, but the stone has already been rolled away, and because of that, they are able to see in. Now, in addition to the indirect evidence, of course, there is the direct evidence of the appearances of Jesus. After his resurrection on Easter morning, he is going to appear, first of all, to the women near the tomb, then to Mary Magdalene. This is, of course, the one that is described in John's gospel. Then to the two on the road to Emmaus. This is described in Luke's gospel and only in Luke. And then he appears to the apostles on several occasions. One on Easter evening, Thomas is missing, according to one of the gospel accounts. Then a week later, Thomas is there. This is in the Gospel of John. Paul is going to talk about the appearances of Jesus. And just like Luke, Paul is going to say that Jesus appeared to Peter on Easter morning. Now, we don't have any stories about this appearance of Jesus to Peter. Luke is going to use his given name, Simon, and he said the Lord has appeared to Simon. But Paul is going to also record that oral tradition from the church, that he appeared to Peter on Easter morning. In fact, Paul is going to say that on one occasion, Jesus appears to more than 500 on one single instance. So there are all of these kinds of stories, narratives. Some are indirect, some are direct. If you've never read it, I would highly recommend that you, at some point in your life, you need to read a story, or not a story, but an investigation of the gospel stories about the resurrection. It is called Who Moved the Stone? And it is by Frank Morrison. This account was written nearly 100 years ago, but it is still in print, and it is still one of the very best examinations of the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Frank Morrison was, I guess, what you would call an investigative reporter. At least that's probably what we'd call it today. He does not begin as a Christian or as a believer. In fact, he begins as a skeptic. But as he reads the stories, as he reads the narratives in the Gospels, in the end, he is going to come to Easter faith. And if you've never read the way that this happens and the kinds of things he examined, I would definitely put it on my reading list. Who Moved the Stone by Frank Morrison. Well, let's talk a little bit more about this story of Jesus appearing to Cleopas and his companion. As I mentioned a moment ago, only Luke gives us this narrative. He appears on Sunday to Cleopas and this companion who are walking along the road to Emmaus. Emmaus is a little village not too far from Jerusalem. Well, they didn't recognize Jesus. In fact, one of the Gospels has a line that says Jesus appeared to some of them in a different form. So we're not sure about how that's supposed to go, but they did get into a discussion about what had happened in the last few days, what had happened in Jerusalem. They seemed surprised that Jesus wanted to know about this, and they basically asked him, "You don't know about everything that's happened in the last few days?" And so Jesus is going to then explain to them how all of the things that had happened were actually the fulfillments of the ancient prophets, even the Torah and the things in the Psalms. In fact, Jesus is going to mention all three sections of the Hebrew Bible: the Torah, the prophets, and the Psalms. Now, the Psalms is the big book that begins the third section of the Jewish Bible, or the Hebrew Bible, which is called the writings, the Ketubim. And this is, in fact, the canon, if you will, of the Old Testament, which today we still recognize just as they did in ancient times. Of course, the Jews do not call it the Old Testament because they don't have a new one. For them, it's just the Hebrew Bible, but it is in fact the very same documents. And Jesus explains how his death is a fulfillment of all of these scriptures. This is probably one conversation that all of us would like to have listened in on. Because if Jesus is talking from the Torah, what would he say about the Torah that was fulfilled in the death of Jesus? Maybe the event of Yom Kippur, probably the event of the Passover. And then he's going to talk about the prophets who have talked about the coming of the Son of David, and particularly Isaiah, who has talked about the coming servant of the Lord. And then, of course, the Psalms, particularly Psalm 22, which is a very vivid description of suffering. And it is the psalm, at least one of the psalms, from which Jesus quotes in prayer on the cross. In all of these things, Jesus explains how his death is a fulfillment of the scriptures. In the end, the two on the road to Emmaus invite Jesus to stop over, to have a meal with them. They have not yet recognized that this is Jesus. But suddenly in the meal itself, when Jesus picks up the bread, gives thanks, and breaks it, they recognize him by this gesture. This is the same gesture Jesus used for feeding the 5,000. It is the same gesture he used on the night in which he held a Last Supper with the disciples. Now he is using that very same gesture. And when he did that, apparently the way he did it was unique enough that these disciples recognized Jesus. And then he disappeared. Well, they rushed to explain this to the others. Here is one of my favorite paintings. I suppose in Renaissance artists, Rembrandt van Rijn is my favorite of the Renaissance artists, the famous Dutch artist from Amsterdam, who was painting nearly 4 centuries ago. But he, in this particular painting, tries to capture that moment when Jesus picks up the bread and begins to give thanks and break it. And it is in that moment that Cleopas and his companion recognize that this is Jesus. So this is in the Louvre in Paris. If you get to go to France and go to the Louvre, I highly recommend that you try to see this painting. Now, Jesus is going to appear to the 11. Luke is going to use the word 11. And this is interesting because if you coordinate this with the description of this appearance in John's gospel, we find that Thomas is not there. And we also know that Judas Iscariot is not there because Judas has committed suicide. So if Jesus appears to the 11, where did the other one come from? You would think it might say he appeared to the 10, but in fact it says the 11. In Luke's second work, the book of Acts, Luke is going to describe how a replacement was chosen for Judas, the replacement being Matthias. And Matthias now will serve as the 12th apostle in the place of Judas. So when Luke uses the term the 11, he is almost certainly referring to the idea that Matthias was there. Now, Matthias wasn't yet recognized as the 12th apostle, but he would be recognized in not very far in the future. And so Luke seems to include him there in Jesus' appearance to the 11. Well, while Cleopas and his companion are reporting that they have seen Jesus, they've recognized him, that they understand he's appeared to Simon, suddenly Jesus stands among them. And he invites them to examine his hands and his feet. Both his hands and his feet still bear the marks of crucifixion. Now that's important because that means that there is continuity between Jesus prior to his death and Jesus after his resurrection. This is why Christians are insistent upon saying that Jesus was bodily raised from the dead. In other words, this wasn't just an apparition. This wasn't just a sort of a cloudy, fuzzy figure in their imagination. This was a resurrection of the body of Jesus. They could actually examine his hands and his feet. Now, it is also probably appropriate to mention that while there is continuity with the body of Jesus prior to his death and after his death and his resurrection, there is also some discontinuity. Jesus has simply disappeared from the home of Cleopas and his companion, and that certainly is something that was not happening before Jesus' death. Here, Jesus is going to appear to them in a locked room. And of course, that isn't something that was happening before Jesus' death and resurrection. So you find in the gospel stories that there is both continuity and discontinuity between Jesus as he was before he died and Jesus as he is after he is raised from the dead. Still, it is entirely appropriate that Christians still wish to use the phrase, the bodily resurrection of Jesus. That is an important phrase, and that is faithful to the gospel accounts. So on this occasion, Jesus is going to eat with them. In fact, later in the book of Acts, Luke is going to record a statement by Peter in which Peter says, the Lord ate and drank with us after his resurrection. That again shows continuity with Jesus prior to his death. And he opens their minds so that they can understand the scriptures. And in Luke's gospel, he is going to climax this with the commission of Jesus that they should preach the gospel to the nations. Now, this commission, which sometimes we call the Great Commission, has a parallel in Matthew's gospel, except that the location is different. In Matthew, Jesus gives the Great Commission in Galilee. In Luke, he seems to give the Great Commission in Jerusalem, not far from Bethany. In John's gospel, John is also going to give a version of the Great Commission in which Jesus says, "As the Father sent me, I'm sending you." How do we reconcile all of those? I would simply suggest that Jesus probably gave the commission to his disciples on more than one occasion. There's no reason for him not to do so. He is appearing to his disciples at different times and in different places, sometimes in Galilee, sometimes in Jerusalem. So there's no reason to deny the possibility that Jesus simply gave what we call the Great Commission on more than one occasion. And if that is true, then Luke, of course, is going to give us one of those accounts. And this one happens actually in the vicinity of Jerusalem just before Jesus' ascension into heaven. Luke is going to close his gospel by describing the ascension of Jesus into the heavens. Jesus not only has risen from the dead, but he is going to ascend back into the heavens, or as Jesus says in John's gospel, "where I was before." This ending is the finality of Luke's gospel, but it's important to note that Luke is going to take up the ascension of Jesus at the beginning of his second work. So as we mentioned in the introductory lecture to the Gospel of Luke, Luke has two works, the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. And the ascension of Jesus becomes the transition point that moves us from the gospel to the book of Acts. So Luke is going to close with the ascension of Jesus, and he's going to open the book of Acts with the ascension of Jesus. So when we get to the very end of the book of Acts and the very last lines, I'm sorry, not the end of the book of Acts, but the end of the Gospel of Luke. When we get to the last lines in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is going to leave the disciples in the Jerusalem temple. After he ascends into the heavens, he blesses them, he parts from them and was carried into heaven. And then the last lines of Luke say, they worshiped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy and were continually in the temple, blessing God. Now, that is an interesting phrase because it has to be taken into conjunction with the idea that you find in the beginning of the book of Acts that the disciples were in an upper room. Was this upper room actually an upper room in the temple? Or was this the situation where they spent the daytime in the temple and maybe in the evening went to an upper room where they slept or ate or something like that? We don't actually know, but in any case, the end of the Gospel of Luke, and Luke, of course, writes both of these accounts. He writes both the account of them being in the temple daily and also the account of them being in the upper room. So I think we should assume Luke is not contradicting himself, but he hasn't actually explained to us how this works. So I'm of the general opinion, and you can take it for what it's worth, that the disciples are spending at least the daytime hours in the Jerusalem temple and probably spending the evenings and their meal times in the upper room. You can take that for what it's worth. But in any case, we come now to the end of the Gospel of Luke. And as we come to the end of the Gospel of Luke, I want to give to you something that is on the cover of one of the books of one of my favorite scholars. There are many scholars that are favorites of mine, but I suppose of all of the scholars that I've read, the one that is probably my very favorite is Frederick Fyvie Bruce, who was a professor at the University of Manchester in England for many years. Dr. Bruce, of course, is now deceased, has been for a number of years, actually. But in one of his works, he gives what I would like to use as the closing to these lectures to Luke's Gospel. Here it is. In Jesus, the promise is confirmed. The covenant is renewed. The prophecies are fulfilled. The law is vindicated. Salvation is brought near. Sacred history has reached its climax. The perfect sacrifice has been offered and accepted. The great priest over the household of God has taken his seat at God's right hand. The prophet like Moses has been raised up. The Son of David reigns. The kingdom of God has been inaugurated. The Son of Man has received dominion from the Ancient of Days. And the servant of the Lord, having been smitten to death for his people's transgression and borne the sin of many, has accomplished the divine purpose, has seen the light after the travail of his soul, and is now exalted and extolled and made very high. This is the gospel of Jesus Christ.